one of the reasons that I'm delighted to have Professor Saich today is that he has published many books on the topic we are discussing today, but one of them is here, the Bible of China Watchers, or CCP Watchers. Perhaps I shouldn't use the word Bible, but it's called From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is highly relevant to the upcoming 20th Party Congress, which will start on October the 16th. In addition, he has written many other books, such as Finding Allies and Making Revolution, the early years of the Chinese Communist Party, that came out 2 years ago, and many other works. Many of them appear on the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center website. And I should mention a recent paper that he published called What to Expect from the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, that just came out on September 5th, which is, as I just mentioned, on the webpage of the Ash Center. And we'll be happy to send you a link to this and to other works, but they are all freely accessible. So we should thank Harvard for that. As I just mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party will hold its 20th Congress starting on October 16th. It's usually lasts for 2 weeks. The last one was in 2017. It will be, in many ways, the usual choreography of party delegates, officials, Chinese media reporting positive things rather than negative things. But this time will be an interesting one, probably as interesting as in 2017. I look forward to hearing your view on that, but particularly because Xi Jinping, the current Secretary General, and also head of the military and state president, will have his term as president, not as Secretary General, because he doesn't need to be extended. He can be Secretary General for life, but as president, extended beyond 2023, and perhaps even longer than that. We shall see. But the context, of course, this year is very special. It was 2022 was meant to be a year of stability. At least that's what the CCP was hoping for, with in order to pave the ground for a peaceful and very positive party congress this fall. But in fact, it's been anything but stable. First of all, there's been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic, has been dragging on, and there are many questions being asked, not just outside China, but also internally, about the zero COVID policy that Mr. Xi has been the chief proponent. If not, he has also imposed it onto the Chinese people. And on top of it, of course, there have been many tensions with the United States and its allies. But meanwhile, the Chinese people are facing an economy that is certainly not as promising that it was just a couple of years ago. The GDP growth is falling. The real estate crisis is serious. Inflation is also rising. There have been a few natural catastrophes, but I'm afraid that's also happening in the rest of the world. But meanwhile, the party, I think the real question that we ought to ask ourselves is whether this party is up to the task and is able to offer a bright future to the 1.4 billion Chinese, as it's been claiming to to offer for the past 100 years, perhaps, or at least since 1949, since it came to power. So maybe we should start first, Tony, just asking what you expect from this 20th party, as you title your essay, and in terms of policy changes and also changes in the leadership of the CCP.
Yeah, thanks, Philippe. I think you sketched very well the background. Clearly, Xi Jinping thought this was going to be a ceremonial march to his third term as General Secretary of the party. But it has been battered, as you said, by a series of unexpected events through the year, and sniping about cult of personalities. Some pieces appeared in the press about Deng Xiaoping and how one of the things he did was stop the cult of personality, which of course is a not too veiled criticism of the way Xi Jinping rules. But I think if you blow away the cobwebs, I think Xi Jinping is pretty clearly the dominant figure and still in power. I don't really see any alternative to that. I think if you look at what he's done over the last 5 years, he's very carefully reorganized a lot of the key apparatus in the Chinese system. He's got his people in place in the military. He has a colleague in head of organization, which of course makes key appointments. Another one in head of propaganda, which of course blasts out the positive glories that Xi Jinping has delivered for the Chinese people. And most importantly, recently he was able to break up those in the intelligence community in China, which I think had been somewhat of a problem for him. So with that as background, what are we going to expect? I mean, I guess if I was perfect at explanations, I would be probably playing at the casino rather than doing this talk. But let me at least put forward some of my best guesstimates. I do think, obviously, that Xi Jinping is going to be extended for another 5 years. In fact, I think if you look at a couple of factors, I think he thinks he's going to be ruling the roost until 2035, at least. The first of that is there is at present no named successor to Xi Jinping. Normally that would have happened at the party congress in 2017, because we look back at the last few turnovers of the leadership, the heir apparent has been pushed forward at one party congress so that they have basically 5 years to work their way in with the outgoing general secretary. Well, no one was really named as an heir apparent. Whether they will be at this one, who knows? The second, though, I think, is that if you look at the plans that Xi Jinping has put forward, they all run pretty much through to 2035, and of course some in a very even more abstract manner to 2049. What does that then mean? I think it means that we're going to see policy continuity rather than policy change. I do think, despite the troubles over this year, most of the elite within the Chinese Communist Party buy in to his policy approaches. I think they feel that real estate was a problematic bubble that had to be not burst, but slowly deflated so that it didn't bring problems to the broader economy. I do think that they bought in on the zero COVID. I'm sure we'll come back to that in a moment in terms of its impact on the economy. But I think there's three reasons for that. First is that, the Chinese rural health system is very weak. If they had a major outbreak of COVID, it could be devastating in the countryside. Secondly, vaccine nationalism has meant that China decided to develop its own vaccines, which would seem to be less effective than those developed in the West. And thirdly, they didn't do a very good job of getting the vulnerable populations vaccinated, the over 60s. I think it was a kind of idea, well, the over 60s don't go out, so they don't need to be vaccinated. So I think on policy choices, there's a fair degree of support for Xi Jinping. I think the thing to look at, and I'll conclude with this on this first topic, is how many of his acolytes can Xi Jinping get into senior positions. We know that 2, perhaps 3 of the standing committee of the Politburo, the most important organization, will step down, and another 8 from the Politburo. That really gives Xi Jinping a wonderful chance to mold a future leadership which is very supportive of his approach. So it'll be important to see whether he has to make compromises to other groups within the party, and therefore perhaps promote some people that might not be on his ideal wish list.
Right. I was wondering if we can just, as a footnote to this, you mentioned in your paper that the People's Daily had suggested that he might be made Renmin Ling Xue, which would mean the people's leader, which would put him on the same level as Mao Zedong. Do you think? I mean, and there were talks that he might become party chairman as opposed to general secretary. I mean, this matters in the sense that it makes him different from his 2 predecessors, that both of them still alive and, you know, and still relatively influential, perhaps, but obviously he has taken so much space for the past 10 years that we don't really know if there's much factionalism anymore.
No, I mean, there's clearly, you know, different opinions, but I think most of those who have dramatically different view to Xi Jinping have already been weeded out. And as one senior party official member said to me a little while ago, you know, they're all Xi's men now. You know, if you want to stay there at the top, you've got to pretty much stay within a pretty tight corridor of what is acceptable for Xi and his policies. Titles do matter, you're right. I mean, I did wonder whether she might opt for the title of chairman, because that gets out of this argument about, you know, exceeding 2 terms as general secretary. Maybe it's something he talked to Putin about. You know, Putin very successfully switched his titles, but kept ultimate power in the Russian system. I mean, let's not be fooled. If he does become chairman, he's still going to have the controlling influence within the party. The other title which is being floated around, and is also one that was used for Mao, is of the helmsman of the party, steering the ship into the future. Mm-hmm. Those will be interesting indicators to look at. Also, I think it'll be interesting to see what gets into the party statutes. It's clear that he's going to be referred to as the core, you know, the core of the leadership, etc. His views and ideology being the core for China to follow. It's possible that the very cumbersome title he has at the moment for his thought might just be simplified to Xi Jinping thought. This all sounds very archaic, but that is putting him also on the same pedestal as Mao Zedong. And there was also a remarkable article not so long ago, which basically suggested that the 10 years of achievements under Xi Jinping had been equal to all those since 1949, and in fact, perhaps in the entire history of China, which is a pretty grandiose scheme. So titles matter, and I think there's no doubt that he's going to get a pretty strong set of accolades. I noticed in the press over the last couple of days, helmsman has been floated, the core has been floated continuously, and also various others of his favorite phrases have been pumped out in the press, all of which to me, again, clearly demonstrates that he's in the prime position to move forward at the party congress.
I mentioned your book earlier, and it's really a history book of the Chinese Communist Party. And last time we talked about this, I asked you what the founding fathers would have thought of the current China, and perhaps, you know, I mean, one of them is still Song Ping. Has been around the news recently. I don't know if he's considered the founding father. He was certainly one of the 8 immortals, if I'm not mistaken. He's still there, so which is good news. 105, I believe. Which is older than the past Queen of England. But more seriously, I mean, what would the founding fathers of the party that started this small operation in Shanghai in the 20th century, early 20th century, would have thought of the party as it is now?
Well, I think they would have had a mixed reaction. I mean, clearly, on the one hand, the fact that it is the ruling party, which was always their intent, I think would impress them. I think the kind of power that Xi Jinping can exert on the global stage would appeal to them. But there might be a degree of ambivalence in other areas. Remember, of course, that first party Congress, they were dedicated to the overthrow of the capitalist system and the imperial powers. And I think with that, they might look at the current world and think, yeah, Xi Jinping, you've not done a bad job. You know, okay, we understand that you benefit from that global economic structure, but you've pretty much got the state in control domestically. Private capital is increasingly where you want it to be, with the restraints put around the real estate sector and the tech sector. And, you know, he's making very clear also for foreign business, if you want to continue operating in China, you can do so, but you will do in a manner that serves the party's interests. So I think it would be a kind of, you know, a mixed report, but on the whole, reasonably positive, I would think, by the founding fathers.
Well, one of the things that you've been doing over the past many years has been to study public opinion in China. And I wonder, I know it's been, you know, lately it's been a little bit more difficult to do field work, but you're one of the few people who've conducted this field research with Chinese citizens, really, on how they perceive the party, the state, their country, and all of this. I wonder if you could update us on perhaps the latest survey that you had and how you read the support that the Chinese population, or at least those interviewed, granted to Xi Jinping when you last interviewed them, and what is the situation now, if we can tell for sure, of course.
Well, the problem is, of course, we don't have access anymore. I mean, it's not just COVID. I mean, under Xi Jinping, China, you know, turned inward quite dramatically, and we were not allowed to conduct the survey anymore since 2016. I should point out that the actual survey asked about citizen satisfaction with government performance, particularly in terms of supply of public goods. And I think that's an important distinction. It's not about the party per se. And what we saw was in the first couple of years that Xi Jinping was in power, in some areas there was a drop in satisfaction. I think in part because he pursued such a vigorous campaign against corruption that it sort of opened the doors to people being more critical, to thinking, oh my goodness, corruption seems to be everywhere. It must also be with our local officials. But what we saw subsequently was a pretty impressive increase in levels of satisfaction, not only with the national government, which you'd expect because people can't really criticize the national government and they get a daily diet fare of how wonderful the center is and all the glorious things it's going to do for you. But more importantly, increasing satisfaction with the performance of local government, which is obviously what is closest to the people. And that was very distinctive. It also showed some variations in what citizens were thinking was important, which I think shows also to some extent that the leadership does respond to what it sees as complaints from within society. Just two quick examples. When we first started the surveys, always corruption ranked as the largest problem that citizens had in mind. And of course, that was something that Xi Jinping acted against drastically after taking power, 2012, 2013. When we started the surveys, environmental health and environmental governance did not figure anywhere in people's thinking as being a problem or that they should be dissatisfied with government's performance. By the last time we conducted the survey in 2016, questions about the environment had actually risen to being one of the areas of work they were most dissatisfied with government. And again, we see the party actually doing a lot in terms of environmental cleanup. What is happening now, of course, is going to be very distorted by responses to COVID. I would imagine if you're sitting in Shanghai, you have a very different view of the competency of the local government than you might have done 2 years ago. And it might be very varied if you were sitting in a different city. If you were in Wuhan when the COVID infections broke out, and would think you wouldn't have a very high opinion of the local government performance. Having said that, a few months ago, I did an online session with some colleagues in China, and they said on many of the indicators, they thought probably if you were to survey today, satisfaction would have held steady and possibly increased with respect to a number of the public services. I suppose the last thing to say on this is the high levels of satisfaction we found with the center does tally with a lot of other surveys done by Chinese and also by people outside of China about trust in government, which you could sort of equate, if you like, with trust of the party, where again, there's relatively high levels of support, which decline as government gets closer to the people.
Let's turn to foreign policy, if I may. One question that we're all trying to answer is what kind of word Xi Jinping wants as the head of the Chinese leadership. He obviously, he has made very clear in the last party congress that he wants China to take center stage. These are his words, and surely his actions for the past 5 years and the actions of Chinese officials, including diplomats. I noticed you mentioned Wolf War diplomats in one of your papers, show that China is certainly not going to stand still and just wait for things to happen. And as we saw perhaps over the summer with the Taiwan Strait crisis, which we can cover perhaps a bit later, but just let's start with what kind of word Xi Jinping wants. It's a small question.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. I mean, essentially what Xi Jinping has said is that China has to be a rule maker, not a rule taker. And I think we see that reflected in different ways. I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that essentially what Xi Jinping wants and the Chinese Communist Party wants is to shape a global environment which is most conducive to it meeting its core interests, not unlike the United States of America in that sense. So this doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that Xi Jinping wants to overturn the entire global order, as did the founders of the Communist Party back in 1921, because obviously China has been a major beneficiary from certain aspects of that. I've always liked the phrase that Jessica Chen Weiss uses of China as a disgruntled stakeholder. So it is a stakeholder in many areas, but it is disgruntled because it hasn't set all the rules of the game, and many of them have been imposed on it. I think that what you see is a differentiation between trying to change those international arrangements and organizations that do not accord with China's interests, the most obvious being in Geneva with the human rights regime. And we saw that most recently, of course, with the report in Xinjiang. As with a number of other fellow travelers, it wants to overturn the influence of that organization and shift its focus. The second area, though, I think, is trying to get a stronger say in areas in the international community that can be beneficial to China. And here I think there's one very important aspect related to that. And it's simply that China, I think, has come to the conclusion, I would say the correct conclusion, that great powers tend to set standards in the industries and technologies of the future. It's the case of the United States, case of the UK before, and they've invested a lot of money in what they see as the 7 or 8 key industries of the future. And yeah, I think they're made in China 2025, dual circulation, etc., are geared to those ends. And they want to then begin to control both the technology which is being used, but I think a number of the organizations which set standards for those technologies. I think that's the game they're trying to play. And, 4 of the specialized UN agencies they have headed, and they deal with standards in things like telecom, agriculture, and so forth. And they've headed another couple of major agencies on international standard setting. So I think that's the second thing that they want to do, and that is really to be able to control international organizations that are essential for the future development of their economy, and related to that, therefore, their global power, or at least not to take the rules set by the West, but to be a key player in establishing those kinds of rules. And the third thing is not surprising, given the first point, that they are going to stand up more strongly for what they feel is their interest. And this is where the wolf warrior diplomacy comes in. Essentially, Xi Jinping licensed that. I think it was 2017 when they had one of the work symposia on foreign affairs work. He made it very clear to the bureaucrats in the foreign ministry, you are not global apparatchiks that have a nice sort of cozy Chinese tea and dim sum with other diplomats around the world and come to some sort of pleasing conclusion. You are first and foremost party members, and you will represent in all those communities the party's interests. And Wang Yi, the current foreign minister, picked that up immediately, as have a number of the other diplomats around the world. And we see a much more strident tone in terms of attacking Western positions and also defending those of China.
Absolutely. I don't think any of the Wolf War diplomats has ever been sanctioned or punished for what usually he said, but rather promoted. And this tells a lot. At the same time, of course, Chinese diplomats are different. Some of them are, more multilateralist than others, perhaps. Which leads me to a question about multilateralism, as opposed to the multipolar world, where we are already standing in the middle of this, but this is certainly something that China has been calling for, and this is also what the China-Russia relationship is about. Perhaps we could say that the two poles, the Russia and the China poles, are working alongside. China is not trying to take over Russia, certainly not Russia taking over China, but they are working closely, and that seems to be the way they are explaining their relationship, their very special relationship. And perhaps you could speak a little bit on multilateralism and also on the very specific case of the Sino-Russian relationship.
Yes, I mean, it's clear that some of the traditional diplomats in China have been disturbed by the push and shift in direction under Xi Jinping, that they feel that, this has brought China to a point of extreme confrontation with the United States of America, with declining support and appreciation in many countries around the world. But that clearly is not any longer the view that's dominating the party elite. I think it's an interesting division you make between multilateralism and multipolar. I mean, like all countries, China will use multilateralism when it can. But basically, I think like the United States of America, probably like the European Union, it would prefer bilateral sets of relationships where it can promote and pursue those. Multipolar, though, is obviously a different set of issues. And anything, I think, for Beijing that will reduce United States influence for them is a good thing. And they couch it, I think, in what they try and phrase as kind of objective terms, not being aggressive, and in a way that I think they will feel will attract other countries around the world. What is wrong with things being multipolar? We don't want, one state dominating everything. So at the sort of the propaganda level, I think it's an effective mechanism. However, I think what underlines it when they talk about their linkages that they're making, I think is part of what I would call geopolitical risk mitigation. And it's to try and create a bond between countries that do not accept the totality of a United States-dominated global order. I suppose one could throw some of the European countries into that, but probably not to the same extent as China. And I think we saw that at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting just recently, where China was clearly trying to pull together, not entirely successfully, I think, a group of countries that it felt might challenge US dominance. Iran apparently wants to enter into that organization. I don't know what the status of that is. But as you said, at the core of it is the no limits relationship between China and Russia. That I don't see Xi Jinping shifting from. It makes it very difficult for the party to find a sort of space to exploit or develop a somewhat different strategy, given that Xi Jinping himself is so closely related to the decisions around Russia. I wonder whether, his caution that he expressed when he met with Putin might not be concerns about you should never have gone into the war, but it might have been more, why on earth haven't you finished it more quickly and then got us out of this mess? And I think for China, a weakened but not chaotic Russia is actually a plus for China. The ongoing conflict, of course, deflects and confuses American reactions and European reactions on how to deal with China. But a weakened but stable Russia also means that it provides a very strong resource and material base for China moving forward in the context of what it sees as clearly the most problematic threat to its future, which is containment by the United States.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question in the chat box, which I'm going to read. We've covered some of it, but not entirely. China has always played on its nationalism, and the Chinese people are generally quite nationalistic. But with the COVID lockdowns, this seems to be changing. How do you view this impacting Xi's rise and hold on to power?
Yeah, I think first, there's a big difference between nationalism and xenophobia. I think Americans and French on the whole are very nationalistic. But the leadership in Beijing, I'll come to the COVID question in a moment, because I think there's another important issue there about the role that nationalism plays in China's responses to events. And I think it's been very careful to play nationalism when it's beneficial, but always to make sure it doesn't get out of control. Because we've seen on a couple of occasions in the past, with the EP3 incident back in 2001, the NATO bombing of the embassy in Belgrade, anti-Japanese demonstrations at various times. People have turned against the government for being too weak. And I think it was also beginning to happen with the visit of Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan. That, you saw online, why aren't we invading? Why haven't we shot the plane down? Why haven't we done this? Why haven't we done that?
Sure.
So they're very worried about a nationalism that really pushes too far. So they're trying to play a delicate game of stoking nationalism because it is an underpinning support when the economy is slowing. And we talked a lot in the past about performance legitimacy. Or does that decline if the economy doesn't grow so quickly? What else can underpin it? Not really Marxism, Leninism, but perhaps nationalism. So with the COVID lockdowns, I don't know. Yes, there's frustration. I think a lot of the lockdowns we've seen in the last month to 6 weeks, 75 or so, were not necessary lockdowns. I think they were local government officials simply wanting to demonstrate fealty to Xi Jinping and his zero COVID policy just before the Congress comes up. So that does give the party some wiggle room to moderate and modify the nature of the lockdowns and to think about how it can structure lockdowns in a more effective way. It has certainly shown up incompetence on behalf of local governments. But again, I'm not sure that really reflects negatively on Xi Jinping's power, because people will see it as incompetence by local government officials rather than the incompetence of Beijing itself, or rather because this is a policy inspired by Xi Jinping himself. So I'm not 100% sure that the impact of those lockdowns are going to have undermined Xi's position. And, you saw the People's Daily immediately after the Shanghai lockdown with a very strong leading article about how it was zero COVID that saved the day, and this does nothing to justify lifting the policy.
And the party secretary of Shanghai is in the run-up to become a standing committee member, or at least staying in the Politburo. He's not going to be sanctioned, that's for sure. He's a powerful man, and he's considered as very close to Xi Jinping. There's another question in the chat. Somebody is interested in your reading of Song Ping's letter. Who mentioned Song Ping, the 105-year-old immortal, former immortal, since he's the only one left. What does it mean? Is it significant politically in the run-up to the Congress?
To be honest, I don't know enough about Song Ping's letter to give a sensible answer. I'll try and say something in a moment. I think the issue you just raised about Li Qiang, the party secretary of Shanghai, it'll be interesting to watch whether, you would have said before that probably Li Qiang was a shoo-in to get into the standing committee of the Politburo. I think it will be an interesting question as to whether his reputation was sufficiently tarnished by what happened in Shanghai to prevent that from happening. And therefore he just stays in the Politburo. I don't think he's going to get removed from the Politburo. It will give some indication, I think, of Xi Jinping's ability just to blow through criticisms or opposition and say, look, I want him, therefore I'm going to get him. So that will be an interesting point to look at. Yeah, Song Ping, Song Ping is an interesting figure. Even in the reform era, we were never really clear how much of a reformer and how much of a conservative Song Ping really was. But I think like a lot of people, they almost sort of put out testaments and statements to reinforce the era that they've come through, if you like. But I really, sorry, I can't make any sensible comments on the letter. I haven't really looked at it in detail, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. It just came up, and obviously, he's it's interesting because he said something about the open door policy and that China should continue to reform itself, and that's the way to go about it. Something like this, but.
Remember Wang Yi when he was recently at the UN? He also used the slogan of reform and opening up. So I think around this time of the Congress, there are bones which are thrown to other groupings within the party. So it doesn't surprise me with Song Ping saying that. Mm-hmm. And also, as I said earlier, we have had, even in quite significant publications, going back a few months, lauding reform and opening. We've also had other pieces saying one of the good things that Deng Xiaoping did was, ending lifelong tenure position and, getting rid of the cult of personality, all of which, of course, is fairly indirect criticism of Xi Jinping and the way he rules. So we know those ideas are out there and, keep sort of coming forward. I think the counter to this, and perhaps this is what, I don't know, but perhaps this is what set off Sung Ping and the letter, and perhaps Wang Yi talking about reform and opening, was the piece in historical research, Li Shi Yanzhou, recently, a piece by the Academy of Chinese History, which was set up by Xi Jinping a few years ago, which actually reinterpreted the Ming and Qing dynasties. It sounds incredibly archaic, but it's like current Italian politics, arguing the current affairs, relating to ancient Rome, I guess. Anyway, but the point it was making was contrary to the fact that the view that China stagnated because of its closed nature, its inward-looking nature, and was not sufficiently open. No, it progressed because it kept out the awful influences of the West and the problematic exploitation that would come from the West. So it sounds an obscure piece, but I think it's a part of this defense that, China's not going to close off completely, but some concerns about the threats of opening up are necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, it's like the current state of China is certainly not of an open space to foreigners. I mean, companies do complain. We haven't spoken about the economy yet, but I wanted to ask you about China's outreach. I mean, it's difficult to have an outreach policy when you're closed, right? On one hand, you want to be you want your ideas and your ideology and your standing to be taken seriously, in the West, but also in other parts of the world. At the same time, you have the zero COVID policy, and you have a number of obstacles to that. And of course, the Party Congress which doesn't make things easy. I wonder whether China's standing, whether at the UN or in other parts of the world, especially this concept we call the global South, and perhaps Asia is more relevant to this particular question, but we could talk about Africa, whether the constituency of this Chinese message is actually reaching out better in these parts of the world that are not the West, surely, and that certainly are happy to go one side or the other, one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that there must be some kind of discussion going on in Beijing around this, because we've seen, Wang Yi, Li Jianshu, and most recently Xi Jinping traveling. So I think they've got the message that closing themselves off, not meeting with people, but just doing everything like we are over Zoom, hasn't really helped them promote their own interests and, bring people on board to their point of view. So I think there's probably some reconsideration of who should travel when and how. And of course, Wang Qishan traveled to London for the Queen's funeral and so forth. So they're sort of slowly dipping their toes back into proverbial water about traveling overseas. But as you said, before the Party Congress and probably before the 2 meetings in March next year, it's going to be a very cautious process. It depends where you are, I think, Philippe. If you're in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, I think the messages from Beijing are pretty well received. But if you go to other countries, I think the messages are much more mixed. I was traveling in Vietnam not so long ago, and they're not great fans of China. But what I do hear when I was able to travel around Southeast Asia, and I'm sure you've heard same kind of reflections, is we do not wish to we do not want to be forced to choose between the US and China. We have to give due consideration to both. And I think what is emerging out of that is a dangerous bifurcation that some years ago, Evan Feigenbaum pointed out, with an economic Asia that increasingly had China at the core, but a security Asia which still increasingly has the United States at the core with its alliances. But it does seem that not just in Western countries, but also in a number of Asian countries, beyond just Japan and South Korea, where you might expect it, that positive sentiment of China seems to have dropped quite strongly. As I said, not in every country. And some countries, I'm sure, have shown themselves to be very supportive of China's views. So it's a mixed picture. I think the way it's going to play out, though, is related to decoupling. Decoupling, of course, is impossible. Complete decoupling is impossible. It's more plausible in some areas than others. But I think where we're going to see a key issue is around AI and technology. Because even though countries in Southeast Asia and Africa might not want to be forced to choose, you're not going to be able to run, two internet systems, one based on Western standards, one based on Chinese standards at the same time. It's just not going to be plausible. And I think that's where a battleground is going to be moving forward. And even though we've heard a lot of issues about all the problems with BRI and the debts which are not being repaid, so on and so forth, I think China's going to reposition BRI first, as it has been doing, to what it calls the green BRI, but I think secondly, as a mechanism to carry its technologies into the global south and to try and dominate the global south in that way. And if you just look at Africa, telecom networks are very strongly Chinese. I mean, not 5G, 3G. Local broadcasting stations, Chinese have been buying up. A lot of local media, carry Chinese news agencies. And so they have different ways as a result to slip their messages into global communities.
And they've been doing this in the case of Africa without much travels being allowed for the past 2 years. I mean, we hear there's about 1 million Chinese citizens in Africa. So these are the people operating within the African continent rather than, planes carrying Chinese tourists or workers, as we saw in the past decade or so, 2 decades.
But I think a lot of those people, are not necessarily carriers of the state. They're often small business people, right. Trading, dealing, wheeling, and so forth. Yeah.
We haven't spoken directly about the US-China relations, but obviously this is, we've reached a state of high tension, to say the least. I don't know whether decoupling can be used in the case of the Sino-American relationship or economic relationship in the next few years. This is something that perhaps the 20th Party Congress will give us indications, although it's not 100% sure. But I wonder how you read the sort of the aftermath of the Pelosi visits to Taiwan. Now, of course, Taiwan is just one aspect. Some people say it's one of the key aspects of the Sino-American relationship, but there are many other things that, that should be included, including competition in technology and AI, as you just said, and of course, diplomacy and ideology. But I think technical and economic matters are what will be more significant.
Yes, I mean, decoupling is a good lens, I think, to start looking at the challenge. There's no doubt that the attitude in Washington now is deeply hostile, antagonistic towards China. I mean, it doesn't matter which agency you speak with, China is the problem. And that's a dramatic shift over the last 6 or 7 years compared with previously. There's almost no nuance in the sounds coming out from Washington. But, you know, it's also not a rational policy. There are just too many areas where both countries' interests would benefit from establishing some form of cooperative relationship. I can talk about that a little more in a moment. And, you know, on the trade sanctions, well, most of the things I've read suggest that it's been more detrimental to American consumers than it has been to China. So why do you keep a policy going that's sort of holding a gun to your own head and saying, if you don't comply with these sanctions, I'm going to shoot myself in the head? Doesn't seem rational or logical to me, but that's the way it is. Decoupling, I mean, we have to first remember decoupling did not start with President Trump. I mean, China started decoupling first. They have stopped Google, they've stopped Facebook, they've stopped a whole bunch of, you know, high-tech companies from operating in China. So they decoupled early on in those fields. If we run through the possibilities, I think, you know, China clearly wants to diversify trade as much as possible from reliance on the United States of America. I think it's building that down. I think it wants to keep strong trading relationships with the European Union as a result of that. I think foreign direct investment, we're going to see declining, both US into China, but also Chinese investments into the United States with the regulations from Congress. One area where decoupling is almost impossible to imagine is in the financial sector. The financial engagement is about $5 trillion, and it's very important for China to maintain access to global financial markets if it wants to meet its future developmental needs. By contrast, as we've said already, you do see that with AI and technology are clearly going to be areas for decoupling to take place. Now, you know, I think you can classify certain areas of actions around the global commons, for example, climate change, which is, of course, the one people always talk about. But there's oceans, there's also control of pandemics, all of which really, in a rational world, the two countries would benefit from some kind of cooperation. And then there's issues of global regulation. You know, are you going to let America be the rule maker in those areas where it dominates and China the rule maker in those areas where it dominates? Can you set up two different regulatory systems for cyber, for trade, internet, so on and so forth? So I think eventually some way is going to have to be muddled through to thinking about how you deal with cooperation in those areas. And maybe that's an area where the European Union could play a positive role. The one thing that causes me greatest concern at the moment is that you and I, Philippe, are probably both old enough to have lived through the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And no matter how desperate the situation was and how little trade there was, how little student exchange, there were structures and frameworks, guardrails for preventing the things just falling apart when a problem arose. And it seems to me the arrogance of Beijing and Washington really mean that those discussions have not taken place about the structures and guardrails we need to manage possible crisis situations or other, you know, potentially problematic areas. And I think, you know, China often for politicians in the US is about domestic politics, as most is actually. Very few international affairs are not about domestic politics. I think Speaker Pelosi's visit was purely about domestic politics, or not purely, as much about domestic politics as anything else. And of course, it was a wonderful gift to the People's Liberation Army. You know, I doubt the civilian leadership would have let them have the kind of full-scale practices that they carried out without Speaker Pelosi's visit. They had to let them have something. They let to have, you know, the nationalist Chinese public have something to show what they were doing. But of course, he was very careful. He didn't fire missiles within certain areas. didn't, as some netizens wanted, shoot down Pelosi's plane, so on and so forth. Personally, I am not as pessimistic on the Taiwan issue as many of my colleagues. I think a lot of Xi Jinping's approaches and attitude has been to stop anybody on Taiwan declaring independence, even though no one of stature is, rather than being pushes for immediate reunification. I think one thing they've taken from the situation in Ukraine is that armed intervention is just not feasible at the present time. I think they've also taken from the situation in Ukraine that they do need to disentangle themselves from as much of Western technology, finance, and consumer goods as is feasible without damaging their own economy. So I think Xi Jinping knows that it's a waiting game. Rightly or wrongly, I think he feels that time is on his side. He hasn't set any deadlines, with the exception of 2049, which is a very vague part of fulfilling the national rejuvenation.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the midterm elections, of course, in the US are going to the China question will be at least mentioned, if not be one of the key foreign policy issues. Tony, you've been very generous with your time, and we're reaching towards the end of our conversation. But I'd like to end with a question which you alluded to, which is the role of Europe. And this session is hosted by the Asia Society France branch. And one question that a number of people in Europe have been asking lately is whether Europe, or the European Union for that matter, can serve as a middleman between China and the United States. And certainly if you read the Chinese press, it's pushing towards this direction, that China will try to engage. And in fact, China is convinced that the Europeans are also very willing to play that role, which is far from certain when you speak to certain people, certain parties, for example, the new Prime Minister of Italy. I wonder if you feel there could be some scope, taking into account, of course, not just the Chinese view, which tends to ignore other people's perceptions, but also some of the US and European views, if I may.
Well, Philippe, you're a far better person to answer this question than I am. But for what it's worth, my sense is that the European Union did not really have a China strategy in many areas, but that with various promptings and pushings, it's becoming more coherent in its response. And for example, inbound investment from China, it seems as though the European Union is beginning to develop a framework and structure not unlike that for oversight in the US. I suppose the real answer to your question is, can there be a coherent policy towards China that covers the whole of the Union, which is always very difficult, of course. Hungary might have a very different view of that. And what are the mechanisms that the European Union might possess to hold that policy together across the Union? Certainly, China has always seen the European Union as a potential wedge with the United States of America, in the same way as it's seen individual countries as possible wedges within the European Union. I mean, it tried that with your own work, much better than I. Its approach to Italy, its approach to Greece, its approach to Spain, Portugal, and so forth, trying to bind them into a kind of economic interest that would mitigate criticisms of some of China's political actions and its human rights abuses, for example. Looking from outside, it seems that there's been more of a pulling together of the European Union for a coherent response to China. Having said all that, I think China views the European Union as less problematic than the United States, which I do think gives you considerable latitude to explore questions and explore issues that are very problematic for the US, especially at the present time, including, key issues such as the climate change, managing oceans, so on and so forth. So yes, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think it's potentially a fascinating time for the European to explore what are the realms of the feasible and what are the limits of the permissible in terms of engaging with China without creating fallout with the United States.
Sounds like a good topic for Asia Society France. There's a last question from Jing Qian. I don't know if you know Jing Qian from Asia Society.
I know Jing very, very well. Hi, Jing.
Okay, so he's asking, how do you think of the rise of the military technology gang, Wang Yong, Ma Xingrui, Rang Guoqing, etc., in recent years and the future prospect? Maybe you can give a quick answer and you can engage with our colleague separately.
Yeah, two quick answers on that. The first is it's quite clear that Xi has been very active in promoting first his own supporters within the military, but also people from the military, especially from the aerospace industry, into key positions. That, I think, is a very definite trend that we've seen, in addition to his old buddies from Fujian, Zhejiang College, so on and so forth. The last thing I wanted to say in this, because I think this is quite important, is that Xi Jinping seems to favor loyalty over technical expertise and capabilities. And the people on the whole that he's been promoting in the civilian apparatus seem to be apparatchiks rather than policy specialists. That concerns me a little for the future, because there's going to be a lot of policy challenges post-Congress that you might want people other than apparatchiks to try and wrestle with for China's future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of this. We've covered a lot of ground and in just an hour, and that was very ambitious. But thanks to you, we've understood, I would say, key facts on Chinese politics. And again, I refer to your excellent book From Rebel to Ruler and your other works, including those that have appeared on the Ash Center webpage. Thank you, Tony. Thanks everybody for your great questions, and looking forward to seeing all of you again in our next event for the official launch of Asia Society France in just about 3 weeks.
Great, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for the questions.
Pleasure. It was great to see you. Thanks, Tony.